a new report on 7 forces reshaping the economy. Talk about that with my guest, Greg Brown. He is Executive Director of the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. Greg, welcome.
Thanks.
So this report that you put out in partnership with the North Carolina CEO Leadership Forum, were these 7 forces that you came up with, were they predefined or did they emerge from your research?
No, they were not predefined. They sort of came out of organic conversations that we had both internally with faculty and staff members at UNC and at the Kenan Institute, as well as with the CEO forum. Obviously, a lot has changed in the economy over the last 6 months. And so I think there was a real desire to understand, okay, what are sort of symptoms of economic forces and what are the true underlying economic forces, and distill a whole bunch of different things that we saw happening down into a more fundamental set of kind of driving forces. You know.
What did you base your conclusions on? Were you doing the research, interviews, just brainstorming among all you guys? I mean, how did you come up with these 7 forces in the first place?
Yeah, so the first thing we did was really catalog everything that we saw happening in the economy around us, you know, in labor markets and consumption, real economy, you know, work trends, obviously the healthcare sector, and you know, sort of just say, okay, here are important things that we see happening. And then we talked to experts. I mean, probably nobody, you know, has a bird's eye view across all of the different things that you know that we ended up you know covering in the report. So we talked to experts. We obviously have faculty with lots of different areas of expertise. So we talked to the folks in marketing and operations and finance, and we talked to the business leaders in different areas. We had primarily a focus on North Carolina, but we think really these economic trends are national and in some cases international trends. Yeah, even though I think our primary focus was really one around policy issues related to, you know, what should North Carolina be doing specifically.
I see. Yeah. Well, the use of the word reshaping implies that you see these as anything but fleeting. Even when the pandemic settles down and subsides, I'm assuming you're saying that these 7 forces are going to continue to have a big influence on the economy.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of broke the future into 2 periods. One is where the pandemic is still having an active impact on the kind of day-to-day operations of businesses, and then the other is a longer term, sort of say permanent impacts to the economy. There's probably not going to be a bright line between those, but there's certainly going to be things that go back to normal, and there's certainly going to be things that are permanently changed.
Yeah. Well, I want to touch on some of them specifically. Let's start with changes in work, travel, and migration patterns. I wouldn't need to read a report in order to conclude that there's going to be a lot less of all that going on, at least the travel and migration patterns. I mean, is that indeed what you found, and what's kind of the nuance behind that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's pretty interesting. So I think what we're going to see is kind of a new equilibrium. That's going to be a separation in terms of how people perceive their physical location. So there's going to be, you know, sort of knowledge workers who have a lot more flexibility, and many of them have found that they are more productive, at least in some of their tasks, working remotely. It's likely that many of these people are going to stay remote or largely remote. This frees them up, right? So, for example, I was speaking with an alum who lives in Baltimore and said there's a real boom of people moving to Baltimore from Philadelphia and New York because it's so much cheaper to live there. Yet they would still be able to commute relatively easily for a day or 2 a week. So they might, you know, change where they are, you know, permanently residing without changing their physical, you know, occupation. There's going to be people that just completely flee as well, though, and decide they don't want to be in an urban center, and maybe they're someone who is not, you know, a knowledge worker, but they decide they want to not be out of an urban environment for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And those are going to be folks that are more likely to be, you know, older with kids, maybe have other family concerns. And then I think we're going to see a continued trend of younger people moving into that vacated space in urban areas. So there's going to be, I think, a shift that breaks along both the type of work people are doing as well as demographics that's going to become more pronounced.
And you have found, in terms of the employers you've spoken to, a willingness to accommodate this.
Certainly in the short run, and I think some people have realized that there's going to be permanent changes there. It's the case that businesses could save a lot of money on commercial real estate if they're able to effectively have a large percentage of their workforce work remotely, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's the potential for real savings there. The larger question is, people in economics talk about, you know, the gains to agglomeration. So having people in the same physical vicinity for whatever reason seems to be associated with gains in productivity. We've seen this well documented in the academic literature. And so the question is, how much of that gain from agglomeration is lost by having a distributed workforce? And that's an open question. It's probably going to vary business by business, industry by industry.
Yeah. The second big trend in the report, accelerating shifts toward on-demand and at-home retail. Now, of course, we know that that was a trend before the pandemic. Are you saying the pandemic has indeed accelerated that, and that acceleration and level of acceptance will increase even afterwards?
Yeah, it's obviously been a big trend historically, but a huge trend the last 6 months in terms of the amount of consumption that's happening in online venues versus in-person venues. But I think the interesting thing about this is not just Amazon's business getting bigger, but what's happening to traditional retailers. So think about grocery stores, right? So the business model for grocery stores has changed quite a bit. So first of all, demand increased tremendously. So there was more than a 10% increase in demand for groceries, but a lot of that demand was satisfied by delivery and curbside pickup. Right, so it's a different model for delivering that maybe more traditional type of retail to the consumer ultimately. So this is something that is going to be a permanent shift because that infrastructure is being put in place right now. And you have consumers that probably would not have made that shift absent the pandemic. Think about older folks who probably have more concern about going in and shopping on their own now, saying, well, just for my own personal health, I'm going to learn how to shop online and then pick it up curbside or have it delivered.
Yeah. Onshoring and widening of supply chains. Now, let's take onshoring first. Do you think that there really is a serious move by manufacturers to bring that production back to the United States from Asia or Mexico or wherever?
Absolutely, and especially from Asia and especially from China. Mm-hmm. So we've seen this in North Carolina. We've seen a tremendous interest over the last 3-4 months, especially in terms of businesses trying to think about relocating manufacturing facilities and some other supply chain logistics type facilities in North Carolina. So we are well positioned as a state just because of our geography and our workforce to sort of see, I would say, be a canary in the coal mine on this. But without a doubt, there is real interest by large companies in bringing certain activities either back onshore or having components of their supply chain that were outsourced now vertically integrated in that process.
Mm-hmm. I imagine, I don't know if you looked into the details of what those factories and what that onshoring would look like in terms of the amount of automation versus the amount of people being hired in the factories, but I would assume that there would be that would be an important element to consider, right?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to go, let's take the furniture industry as an example.
Which is huge in North Carolina.
What was huge in North Carolina.
What's huge in North Carolina.
So a lot of that moved offshore over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Some of that is going to come back now, but it is going to come back in a different form. As you note, it's going to come back in a much more automated process. So you'll have many fewer workers working in more automated facilities, generating furniture and furniture components domestically.
Mm-hmm. Risk assessment by capital providers. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about what happened to, say, a commercial lender over the last 6 months. So commercial lenders have, probably, decades, in some cases, centuries of experience underwriting different risks. So they have very precise models for the risk they're taking on when they lend to a hotel or a manufacturer or a healthcare provider, right? Because they can look at, how did these different types of industries perform during a recession, during a downturn? Well, throw that all out the window, right? That the types of risks that we saw during the pandemic were completely outside the bounds of any sort of underwriting that was being done by commercial lenders. The same is true of equity investors. The risk posed by the pandemic was an entirely new risk. So what's happened is, financial markets have had to rethink what is the set of risks that they have to bear as investors, right? And what are the risk premia that they should command for different industries, different size companies, the different types of operations that they would look at as being indicative of the ability to repay or generate a return on investment. So it's a fundamental rethinking of what constitutes risk in the real economy, and therefore how investors should be allocating capital and the risk premia that they should be demanding.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if that might make access to capital difficult, especially for smaller companies that don't have that many options. Three others, just quickly name them as part of your study: shocks to healthcare and pharmaceutical demand. Certainly, we're seeing that already. Upending of education and childcare, again, big one. And finally, renewed focus on diversity and dismantling systemic racism, which of course is a nationwide effort underway right now. Sorry we don't have more time to get into those in detail, but Greg Brown of the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise, thank you so much for leading us through some of the high points of your new report on 7 forces reshaping the economy. Thanks very much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.